Hey everyone, welcome to Wealth Redefined. I'm your host, Michael Reynolds, independent financial advisor and owner of Elevation Financial. Thanks for joining me today. Glad you are here as always. All right, today's definition time. We're going to talk about custodians. We're going to kind of define it, unpack a little bit about what it means. It's one of those terms that gets thrown around in financial services, and I like to define terms because the financial services industry can be a bit mysterious, a bit confusing, and the more we can define and kind of make transparent and unpack, I think, for people, the better, so we can all understand what these terms mean and what they do. So we're going to talk about what is a custodian today. So in financial services, a custodian is the company that has possession of your financial assets. It's a brokerage company, a commercial bank, some type of institution, and they hold your money or your investments for your convenience and your security. So that's kind of the bland, kind of clinical definition of what a custodian is. So when you are working with a financial advisor, for example, they're typically going to have a custodian they work with to hold your money. Or if you work directly with like a Fidelity or a Vanguard, often they will be the custodian. But your money and your investments have to be held somewhere. And the custodian is the organization or the institution that holds those assets for you. The money, sometimes the cash, often the investments, the actual stocks, the bonds, those assets are held at the custodian. So the custodian serves a number of purposes or has a number of functions. One function we just defined is just to hold the assets. Another function that a custodian offers is as a broker when you buy or sell your investments. So when you, for example, want to invest new money, you move money into your account, let's say your IRA or your Roth IRA, and you want to take that cash and purchase stocks with it, or purchase mutual funds, or purchase new investments. The custodian handles the transaction. So you will say, hey, I want to purchase, X shares of this ETF or $500 worth of this mutual fund. And the custodian will then take the money and facilitate the transaction. It will facilitate the buy or the sell if you're selling, for example. If it's a market transaction like an ETF or a stock, the custodian will match your offer to buy with another party's offer to sell, and it'll facilitate the transaction and purchase that security for in your behalf for that stock. So the custodian serves, again, as that broker that facilitates the transactions required in order to invest money and turn that money into investments or purchase investments like stocks or bonds or funds with that money you put in. Another thing that custodian does is they keep track of all of your trades and financial transactions along with your tax forms. So with every transaction, you're going to have a documented paper trail, so to speak, and the custodian will keep track of those transactions. They will also keep track of that information to use for your tax form. So for example, if you have a taxable brokerage account and you sell investments throughout the year, you've got taxable gains, the custodian will issue a 1099 form that documents those gains so that you can report that on your taxes, for example. Or if you make a contribution to an IRA that is tax deductible, or the transactions that have some sort of tax impact, the custodian will then issue those tax documents that you will then use to plug into your tax return when you're filing so that your information is accurately reported. So custodians keep track of all that for you, which is really important because that's something that we're not necessarily well suited to keep track of ourselves. The custodian handles that for us from an administrative standpoint. So that is kind of the summary of the general functions of the custodian. So what are some examples of custodians? A lot of the big names you already know, those are custodians. For example, TD Ameritrade is a custodian, Schwab, Fidelity. I use a custodian primarily called Altruist. It's a smaller, less well-known one. There are a lot of custodians out there. The big names you've heard of, the institutions, they generally hold a lot of money for investors, and there are lots of different custodians out there, some well-known, some less well-known. But again, some of the bigger names you've heard of, those are custodians, and those are the ones that hold money for investors. So how does a custodian work when you're working with either as an individual investor or you're working with a financial advisor? So if you're working, directly, well, let's say you have an IRA set up with, Fidelity, for example. And by the way, I'm not endorsing any of these custodians I'm naming. These are not endorsements. They are simply examples. So let's say you go to Fidelity and you set up an IRA with Fidelity. You'll invest your money. You'll put money into your account, and Fidelity is the custodian that holds your money. But let's say you work with a financial advisor like me, for example, a smaller firm, someone with a small business practice setup. They are not holding your money. They do not have what's called custody of your money. Now, in some cases, some financial advisors do have custody. It's not terribly common, at least among advisors like me, the type that I kind of represent. The ones that you're going to typically come across are the ones that are going to work with a custodian to hold your money. So when you invest with me, I never have access to your money. Honestly, I never have access to kind of hold your money or have a level of access that means I can move it around. Now, if you give your financial advisor permission, sometimes that advisor will have access to move money from your bank account into your investment account or vice versa with your permission, but that is the extent of it. The advisor can never take your money out or do anything else with it. And that is typically how it works. So if you're working with a financial advisor like me, the advisor is going to have the personal service to put the financial plan together for you, do the consulting with you, and manage the investments. The advisor will be able to manage investments and move investments around, but the actual money is stored at the custodian. So that reassures a lot of people because some people are kind of confused and it seems mysterious. They think they're handing over money to an advisor and it's sort of a black box, and it's not really how it works. The advisor is the consultant that works with you to do planning and answer questions and provide advice for you and manage the investments. But the actual money, the actual assets are stored with a third-party custodian. That's typically how it works. So again, I use a custodian primarily called Altruist. That's the one I use. I also use TD Ameritrade for some of my clients. Other advisors use Fidelity or Schwab or Shareholder Service Group or Interactive Brokers. There's a lot of names out there. But the business brand is the advisor's business. The custodian holds your money as the client. So that's a really good system because that kind of allows the personal service of a small business financial advisor to be able to work with you one-on-one directly, while the custodian provides kind of the heavy lifting of the asset storage and the asset custodial services. So what are the benefits of working with the custodian? Why do they exist? Why are they important? The security is important. Custodians are fairly well-established organizations that have a lot of security in place to hold your assets. They have, bank level security to make sure that your money and your assets are safeguarded. They're held securely. The documentation is also really important. Like I said before, it's pretty unlikely that any of us are going to maintain the proper documentation required to have clean, organized finances as we're investing. The custodian provides that documentation for us. That's a huge benefit. It's a huge perk to working with the custodian. The administration kind of goes along with that as well. The administration of, brokering the trades, keeping track of transactions, managing the documentation, all that administration is highly valuable and really important, especially when it comes to taxes and reporting. So that's why custodians exist, is to do all those functions, to handle that. So does it matter? Does it matter who your custodian is or who you're working with or where your assets are held? Kind of yes and no. I would argue that for the most part, it doesn't really matter when it comes down to it, as long as you're working with a well-established name. So for example, if you're working with a financial advisor and that financial advisor is working with Schwab or TD Ameritrade or Fidelity or Shareholder Service or Altruist or a custodian that is a reasonable size, reasonable track record, fairly well-known name, you're not really going to have issues. I mean, you're typically going to be as safe as it could be anywhere. Now, I work with one, for example, it's kind of newer. It's called Altruist, but the custodian itself that holds the money is not actually Altruist, the company. It is Apex Clearing. So a lot of times it's kind of a layer that is not always obvious. So you might be working with an organization that, from a brand standpoint, kind of presents themselves as the custodian, but the actual assets, the actual investments are held at a different company behind the scenes as kind of a private label service for that organization. So the example I just used is Altruist. So my primary custodian is Altruist. That's where I manage my clients' money. That's where it's held. But the money is actually not held with the company called Altruist. Altruist kind of outsources custodial services to Apex Clearing, which is a huge custodian that manages a lot of money. And so there's kind of that safety and that reliability of having a large custodian behind, the smaller tech company that kind of manages the front-facing aspects of working with your money and getting access to your money. So there's sometimes layers. For example, shareholder services group, or works with Pershing. There's a lot of companies that outsource custodial services. So at the end of the line, there's usually going to be a large custodian behind anyone you work with that handles the safekeeping and the safeguarding of your money. So does it matter? Yes and no. I mean, the one thing that matters to me is the technology and the user interface. That's not always important to everybody, but one reason I work with Altruist as my primary custodian is because the user interface is modern, easy to use, very comfortable, great mobile app, great mobile experience. And so a lot of custodians out there, especially the older ones that have been around for a while, their technology is a little bit clunkier, a little more dated, not always a great user experience. So to me, if I'm looking at a custodian, I want I want a company that I'm going to have, easy access to, great mobile experience, good tools to use for reporting and seeing things and getting access to documentation. That's the kind of stuff I look for. But those are kind of picky things. Those are kind of my preferences, and not everyone cares about those things, but I do, which is why I use a custodian that is very high tech and very modern. So with that is our definition time for today, specifically about custodians. So custodian, again, to recap, holds your assets, holds your investments, holds your money, provides documentation, provides administration and reporting, and all those services kind of bundled together. So when you're working with an advisor, that advisor is typically going to hold your money at a custodian for safekeeping, which is very reassuring and very safe and reliable, which allows the advisor the flexibility to work with you with that relationship kind of backing them up. So that is our discussion today on what is a custodian. So thanks for joining today. If you have questions, as always, feel free to reach out. Many of you that have been listening, do reach out and book a meeting on my website, which is elevationfinancial.com. I always encourage everyone to grab a time using that button on my homepage. It'll take you to my contact page where you can schedule an appointment. I call them a complimentary money session. They're about 45 minutes, and I answer any question you want. And if you'd like to learn more about working with me, you can. If not, that's no big deal too. Super low pressure. I'm just happy to answer questions. So again, that's elevationfinancial.com. If you want to contact me directly, just reach out at podcast@elevationfinancial.com. Thanks again for joining me today. As always, have a great day. See you next time. Hey, Antonio, thanks for joining me today. I just saw you pop in right as I was wrapping up the audio recording portion. So I'm going to pop Antonio on screen there. His profile picture looks like he's at the beach. So I hope you're on a great vacation, or at least enjoyed a great vacation recently. So thanks, Antonio. Good to see you. And if you have any questions, feel free to pop those in the comments if you want to right now. If anyone else is joining and wants to pop any questions in, feel free to do that in the next 5 seconds or so as I wrap up. As always, as you might know, I broadcast every Tuesday at 1:30 p.m. Eastern, so you can always hop on. I did miss last week because of a scheduling kind of a glitch that popped up, but I try to be here every week. So I'll be here again next week. As always, that'll be episode 99 next week, actually, so I'm coming up on 100. So with that, thanks again for joining us. See you next time.